bruised. Every last one of them bruised, the skins pocked and split where the hail had come down out of a green August sky and hammered the orchard flat in 9 minutes. The wagon they were piled into stood at the back of the loading yard behind the Callaway feed store in Merrow's Bend, and the apples in it had gone soft on their shaded sides, the flesh browning under the punctures, a smell already rising off them that was half sweetness and half rot. Nobody had bid on that wagon. Nobody had even walked close enough to look. And Idella Frayne, 23 years old and back in the county not 4 months, stood at the tailgate with her hands loose at her sides, saying nothing, looking at the whole ruined lot of them the way a person looks at weather coming. She stood there a long time, long enough that Merle Pettigrew, who ran the auction off the flatbed with a clipboard and a voice like a rusted gate, called out, did she want them, or was she just grieving? And Idella said she'd give $3 for the wagon load, and the yard laughed, and Merle wrote it down because $3 was $3 more than anybody else had offered for a heap of fruit that would be black by Thursday. He told her to haul it before it drew flies to his lot. She said she would. She counted out 3 worn bills from a coin purse and laid them in his palm one at a time, and the men leaning on the fence rail made their remarks, and she did not appear to hear a single one. If you know what it is to be told that the thing in your hands is worth nothing, do me a small kindness before we go on. Tap that like button so this story finds the others who have heard those same words, and leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from, your town, your county, your corner of the map, because I read them, and I like to know who's out there in the dark listening to a story about a girl and a wagon of ruined apples. Now, back to the loading yard, and the fruit already going soft, and everything nobody yet understood. The apples had come off the old Harkness place, 12 acres of neglected trees on the ridge above the Sawtooth Road, and the man who'd owned them had let the hail be his excuse to quit an orchard he'd been quitting for years already. He sent the salvage to auction and washed his hands of it. What the county saw standing in that yard was garbage with stems. What Idella saw, she did not explain, because she rarely explained anything, and because she was not entirely sure yet herself. She only knew the same thing had been true her whole life, that things thrown away had a way of speaking to her if she was quiet enough to let them, and she had learned young to be quiet. She backed her great-aunt's flatbed truck to the wagon, and she and a lanky 16-year-old named Cordell Tuff, who hung around the feed store for the $1 or $2 a loading work, transferred the apples basket by basket, while the men watched and offered advice nobody had asked for. One of them, Boyce Ledbetter, who ran 400 acres of soybeans and corn down in the bottoms and considered himself the practical conscience of Merrow's Bend, told her flat out she was hauling money into a ditch, told her a bruised apple was a dead apple, that the whole load would be cider vinegar and stink inside a week, and that a girl who'd been gone as long as she had ought to spend her first summer back learning what things were worth before she went spending on what they weren't. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way he'd say the price of diesel, a fact offered for consideration. Idella set the last basket on the truck bed, wiped her hands on her jeans, and told him she supposed she'd find out. That was all. She climbed in and drove the ruined apples up the Sawtooth Road to the place that was hers now, and the men agreed among themselves that they had watched $3 die. She had come back to the county in April, not because she had a plan, but because there was no other direction that made sense once her mother passed, and the little rented life they'd shared in the city folded up around her. Idella's mother had left the county at 19 and never spoke well of it, and so Idella had grown up with only the vaguest inheritance of the place, a few names, a smell of wood smoke she couldn't source, and the knowledge that somewhere up on a ridge there was an old woman she was related to who wrote her a card each Christmas in a hand like bent wire. That old woman was her great-aunt, Verna Saul, her grandfather's sister, and when the lawyer's letter came saying Verna had put Idella's name to the deed of the ridge property provided the girl actually came and lived on it, Adela packed 2 bags and rode a bus most of a day and walked the last 3 miles up from where the county road quit. She had expected a stranger. What she found was a woman of 80-some years in men's work trousers and a canvas coat, splitting kindling in a dooryard, who looked at Adela a moment and said only, "You've got Emmett's hands," and went back to her splitting. Emmett had been Adela's grandfather. He'd been dead 40 years. That was the first thing Adela ever learned about him, that his hands had come down to her across all that distance, and it would not be the last. The place was called Windfall, though nobody had painted the name on anything in decades. It sat on a shoulder of the ridge with an old orchard of its own gone half wild, apple and pear and a few plum, and a barn with a stone-floored lower room cool as a cave, and a house that had settled but had not given up. Verna lived in 3 rooms of it and let the rest keep its dust. She said little. She rose before light, worked till dark at the 100 small maintenances a place like that demands, ate plainly, and offered Adela neither instruction nor welcome beyond a made bed and a place at the table. But she watched. Adela came to understand that being watched by Verna was a kind of teaching, that the old woman was measuring her the way you'd measure a colt you weren't sure of yet, and that praise, if it ever came, would come disguised as work handed over. In the first weeks, Verna handed over nothing. Then one morning she pointed her chin at the hen house and said, "Yours now?" and walked off, and Adela understood she'd passed something. She kept the hens. She kept them well. And in the evening she wrote in a spiral notebook she'd bought at the crossroads store. Small observations, the weather, what bloomed, what the old trees on the place were doing, because writing things down was how she thought. And because her mother had never told her anything, and she was determined to be a person who knew things. It was in the barn, in the cool stone-floored lower room, that Adela found the other inheritance. Behind a stack of rotting seed sacks, and under a tarp gone stiff as bark, stood a press. A cider press, cast iron and hardwood, the screw thick as her wrist, the slatted basket black with age and long-dried pomace. It was a heavy, serious machine, the kind a man buys once in his life and hands down, and it had not turned in longer than Adela had been alive. She stood and looked at it a long time in the barn's dim light, the way she looked at everything before she touched it. Then she went and found Verna and asked whose it was. Verna wiped her hands and came and looked at the press herself, and something moved behind her face that Adela had not seen there before, some door opening onto a room a long way back. "Emmett's," Verna said. "He made the best cider in 3 counties. People drove up here for it in the fall, before he died." Adela asked what happened to it, the cider, and Verna said, "He died." As though that answered everything, which in a way it did. Then Verna said one more thing, offhand, already turning to go, and it was the thing that would run through everything that came after, the thing Adela would write in her notebook that night and underline twice and come back to 100 times. Verna said, "He never used a good apple in his life, used what nobody wanted, said the ugly ones had all the flavor and none of the pride." Adela did not understand it that April. She filed it away the way she filed everything, and she went on keeping hens and learning the trees, and the spring turned to summer, and the summer turned hot and dry and then broke, on that green August afternoon, into the hail that flattened the Harkness orchard on the far ridge and sent a wagon of ruined fruit to the Callaway auction. And Adela, who had by then read her grandfather's words in her own handwriting a dozen times, who had spent a summer watching apples and thinking about pride and flavor and what nobody wanted, drove into Merrow's Bend that day, already knowing, in the wordless way she knew things, exactly what she meant to do with $3. She just didn't tell anybody. She had noticed in her months back that telling people your intentions in that county was the same as inviting them to explain why your intentions were foolish, and she had no use for the explanations. So she let Boyce Ledbetter believe she'd hauled money into a ditch, and she drove her ditch money home, and she began. She and Cordell Tuff unloaded the wagon into the cool stone room, and that evening Idella scrubbed the old press with a wire brush and vinegar and hot water until the hardwood came up honey-colored and the iron shed its rust and orange curls. Verna watched from the barn door without offering to help and without telling her to stop, which from Verna amounted to encouragement. The next morning Idella began to sort. This was the work that the men in the loading yard would never have believed a person would do, because it was slow and it was small, and it paid, on its face, nothing. She took each ruined apple in her 2 hands, the hands that had come down to her from Emmett, and she turned it in the light, and she cut away what had gone bad and kept what had not. A hail-struck apple she found was not a dead apple. It was a bruised one. The bruise was a small violence the flesh had suffered and then walled off. A brown and softened place you could cut around, and beneath and beside it the fruit was often better than sound, because the tree, sensing the wound, had rushed sugar to the injury the way a body rushes blood. She did not know the botany of it. She knew the taste. She bit and tasted and spat and cut, and she wrote in her notebook that the worst-looking apples in the wagon were, more often than not, the sweetest, and she remembered what her grandfather had said about pride and flavor, and for the first time she felt the old man's sentence turn from riddle into instruction. It took her 4 days to work through $3 of apples, 4 days of cutting and sorting on the cool stone floor, her back aching, her thumbs pruned and stained, the good flesh going into one tub and the bad into a bucket for the hens, who came to associate the sound of her knife with feasting and grew fat and glossy that August. Cordell came up the ridge on his bicycle a couple of those afternoons and helped without being asked much, because he was a boy who liked to be near work that felt like it meant something, and his own father's farm had been sold out from under the family 2 years back, and he had a hunger to see somebody make something out of nothing. When the sorting was done and the good flesh chopped, Idella and Verna loaded the press together, the old woman's hands remembering a rhythm the girl was only learning, layering the pomace between clean cloths in the slatted basket, cranking the great screw down slow. The first juice ran out amber and cloudy into a crock, and the smell of it filled the stone room, and it was not the smell of the ruined wagon anymore. It was the smell of every autumn that place had ever had. Verna cupped a little in her palm and tasted it and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "That's it. That's Emmett's." And Idella understood that she had reached back 40 years with her grandfather's hands and pulled his cider up out of the ground. She pressed maybe 6 gallons out of that first ruined wagon. She strained it and let it settle and bottled some sweet in scrubbed jars and set the rest in the coolest corner of the stone room to see what it would do, because Emmett's notes, which she found later in a cracker tin under the barn eaves, spoke of letting the wild yeasts on the skins do their slow work through the cold months. She wrote it all down. She wrote the dates and the weather and the taste of it changing. And in the middle of September, she carried a dozen jars of the sweet cider down the Sawtooth Road to the Crossroads store, where a woman named Loretta Quist ran the register and the gossip both. And she asked Loretta if she'd sell them on consignment, $1 a jar, and Loretta could keep a quarter. Loretta looked at the jars, cloudy gold with a finger of sediment, and looked at the girl, and said she'd heard Idella had thrown $3 away on rotten fruit at the Callaway sale. Idella said she had. Loretta said, and this is what came of it, and Idella said, "Try it." Loretta unscrewed a jar and tried it, right there at the register, and her face did a thing it did not usually do, which was go quiet and surprised, and she set a jar aside for herself and put the other 11 on the shelf by the door, and said she'd see. That was the whole of it. No sign, no fanfare. 11 jars on a shelf. They were gone by the weekend. Loretta called up the ridge because Verna kept a telephone, though she rarely answered it, and told Idella the cider had walked out the door, that a man buying feed had bought 2 and come back for 4, that the delicate woman who cooked at the church had asked where it came from, and could she get a gallon for her supper. Adela took the call standing in Verna's kitchen, and she said she'd bring more Friday, and she hung up, and she did not smile large or make a sound, but she stood a moment with her hand still on the phone, and Verna, at the stove, said, "Well," without turning around. And that was the 2 of them celebrating. It was a small thing, 11 jars, then a request for more. But it was the first crack of daylight through the thing the county was certain of, and Adela knew, in the wordless way, that daylight, once it starts through a crack, does not go back. Through the fall she pressed what she could gather. The $3 wagon was long gone, so she went looking for the ugly and the unwanted, which was the whole of Emmett's philosophy and now hers, and she found there was more of it than anybody imagined. She drove the county roads and knocked on doors and asked people if she could pick the apples going to waste under their old dooryard trees, the drops and the scabbed and the wormy and the small, the fruit that grocery-minded folks wouldn't touch and let fall for the deer. Most people thought she was strange and said yes just to be rid of the question. Some let her have whole trees for the hauling. She got early drops from a widow named Pearline Hazlitt, who had 6 ancient trees and no teeth to eat them with. And she got a truckload of little russeted apples off a fence row. The Ledbetters didn't even know they owned, though she asked Boyce's wife, and not Boyce, who'd have found a reason to say no on principle. She got knobby seedling apples from a hedgerow along the Ottaway Creek that no one had planted and no one claimed. Sharp little things that made your mouth pucker. And she learned that a hard sour apple that was worthless to eat was worth its weight in a blend, because it gave the cider a spine. She wrote it all in the notebook, which trees, which tasted how. When they dropped, she was building, without calling it that, a map of the whole county's forgotten fruit, and she was the only person alive who held it. Cordell became her regular hand, paid in dollars and cider and the dignity of the work, and he was good at climbing and better at charming old ladies out of their windfalls. And between them they filled the stone room with fruit that fall. Verna pressed alongside them when her joints allowed and directed from a stool when they didn't, and she began, in her sparing way, to hand down the things Emmett had taught her. She showed Adela how to build the cheese, the layered stack of wrapped pomace, so it wouldn't blow out under the screw. She showed her how to tell by the color and the ropey way the juice ran when the fruit was pressed dry. She told her the cold room was the secret, that Emmett had chosen this exact stone-floored corner of the barn because it held 40-some degrees deep into the winter, and that cider made itself if you gave it cold and time and left off fussing. "Leave it be," Verna said. That was near a whole philosophy from her. Leave it be. Adela wrote that down, too. By the middle of October, the Crossroads store could not keep the cider on the shelf, and Loretta had started keeping a list of names of people asking, and word had gone up and down the county the way word does, not through any advertisement, because Adela never bought so much as a line in the Marrow's Bend Weekly, but through the mouths of people who had tasted a thing and could not stop telling about it. The delicate woman served Adela's cider at a church harvest supper, and 40 people asked her where it came from. A trucker took a jar to his mother 2 counties over, and the mother telephoned the Crossroads store to order 6. There is a kind of fame that money cannot buy and cannot manufacture, and it is the fame of a thing that is simply, undeniably good, passed hand to hand by people who gain nothing by praising it except the pleasure of having been right. That fall, that was the only kind of fame Idella had, and it was already, quietly, more than enough. It was in October, too, that Boyce Ledbetter said the thing the whole rest of the story would spend itself disproving. He said it at the feed store, in the back where the men gathered around the cold stove that wasn't lit yet, and he said it because somebody mentioned that the Frayne girl's cider had turned up at the church supper and been the talk of it. Boyce, who had watched her haul $3 into a ditch, was not a man who enjoyed being contradicted by events, and he said what men like him say, which was that it was a fad and a fluke, that a girl selling jars of juice off a card table was not a business and never would be. That novelty sells the first jar, but nobody builds anything on rotten apples and good luck, and that come next fall she'd be gone back to the city where she came from, and Windfall would go to seed like it had been going for 40 years. This leads to nothing, he said. You market. There's no money in what nobody wants, or somebody'd have made it already. And the men around the cold stove nodded, because it sounded like wisdom, because it was the kind of thing that is almost always true, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous, and because none of them had tasted the cider, and none of them had watched the girl turn a bruised apple in the light and cut away the death and keep the sweetness. Market, Boyce said again. Nothing. And the county, out of long habit, marked it. Winter came hard to the ridge, and Adela did the thing that separated her from every fad and every fluke, which was that she waited. The sweet cider had sold itself out by Thanksgiving, and she could have chased that, could have pressed and bottled and sold sweet all she was able and called it a business, and it would have petered out by spring the way Boyce predicted, one more seasonal novelty. But she had her grandfather's notes in the cracker tin, and the note spoke of the long, cold work, the fermentation that turned mere juice into something that kept and deepened and asked to be sipped rather than gulped. And Adela understood that the sweet cider was the doorway, and the hard cider was the house. So she let the crocks and the carboys in the cold stone room do what 40 degrees and wild yeast and patience do. And she resisted, all through December and January, the temptation to hurry them. She checked them. She wrote down what she found. She tasted a thimble here and there and spat and waited some more. Verna approved of this in her silent way. Emmett never sold a drop before February, Verna said one snowy night by the stove, and never a drop he wasn't proud of, and folks learned to wait on him, and the waitin' made them want it worse. Adela wrote that down. The waitin' made them want it worse. She spent that winter learning the machine and the barn in her own hands. She rebuilt the press where it had loosened, sanded and oiled the wood, trued the basket. She scrubbed and scalded every crock and carboy and jar until the stone room was clean as a dairy. She read Emmett's notes until she near had them memorized, the man's cramped pencil coming alive in her mind, and she found in them not just method, but temperament, a whole way of regarding the world that matched her own so closely it unsettled her. He wrote of the ugly apples the way she'd have written of them. He wrote once in a line she copied out and pinned above her work table that the world throws away its best flavor because it can't get past the look of it, and that a man who'll stoop for what others step over need never go hungry. She read that 100 times that winter. She thought about her mother, who'd left this place and never spoke well of it, and she wondered if her mother had ever known what her own father wrote, and she felt across the years a kind of kinship with a dead man she had never met, and a grief for a living mother she had only just lost, tangled together the way such things are. And she did not try to untangle them. She just worked. The work held the grief the way the cold room held the cider, kept it from spoiling, let it become something a person could bear. In late January, the county had its first real test of whether Idella was a fad, and the test came in the form of Boyce Ledbetter's own household, though he never knew it that winter. His wife, Odessa Ledbetter, had bought a jar of the sweet back in the fall for a pie, and had not forgotten it. And when the Crossroads store had none, she asked Loretta where a person might get more, and Loretta, who missed nothing, told her the Frayne girl had gone quiet for the winter, but that word was she was making something stronger for the spring, and that if Odessa wanted to get on the list, she'd best get on it now. Odessa got on the list. She did it privately, and she did it under her maiden name, Odessa Cull, because she knew what her husband had said at the feed store, and she was not a woman who enjoyed her husband being wrong in public any more than he did. So the first Ledbetter to come around did it in secret, penciled onto a list at the Crossroads store, and that small private surrender, months before the public one, was the first true measure that Boyce's prediction had begun to turn. February came, and with it the day Emmett would have sold. Adela tasted the hard cider through, carboy by carboy, and found that the cold room and the wild yeast and the strange sour hedgerow apples had done exactly what her grandfather's notes said they would. The cider had gone dry and clear and a little sharp, with a depth to it that the sweet had only hinted at, a taste of the whole autumn folded down into something you could hold in a glass, apples and cold nights and wood smoke, and the particular mineral tang of that ridge. She bottled it in scrubbed brown glass she'd been collecting all winter, and she carried the first case down to Loretta and set it on the counter and said, "This is the one they've been waiting on." Loretta priced it and put it out, $4 a bottle, which was dear for that county, and Adela braced for the men to laugh at the price the way they'd laughed at the Wagon. They did not get the chance to laugh long. The first case sold in 2 days, the second in 1. By the last week of February, people were driving up the Sawtooth Road itself, past where the county blacktop quit, up the frost-heaved gravel to Windfall, to buy it at the source because the store could not keep it, and Adela found herself for the first time with a line of vehicles in her dooryard and a stack of dollars in a coffee can, and a great aunt watching all of it from the porch with an expression that on anyone else would have been a smile. She did not raise the price to meet the demand, though a person with a business mind would have told her to, though Cordell, who was becoming shrewd, suggested it. She kept it at $4 because Emmett's note said a fair price makes a customer for life, and a greedy one makes an enemy, and because she was not, at bottom, in it for the money, though the money was welcome and she was not fool enough to pretend otherwise. She was in it for the thing itself, for the vindication of the ugly apple, for the pleasure of watching a man drive 20 miles for a bottle of something he'd have let rot on the ground the year before. And she was in it, though she'd have been slow to say so, for Emmett, for the man whose hand she carried, whose cider she had raised up out of the cold ground of that stone room, whose county was, 1 bottle at a time, learning to want again the thing it had let die with him 40 years past. That was a kind of resurrection, and Adela felt it, and Verna felt it, and neither of them said the word out loud, because you did not, in that family, make a ceremony of the things that mattered most. Word went out past the county that spring, the way water finds the low ground. A food writer from the city paper, up in the hills for a wedding, tasted Adela's cider at the reception and wrote 300 words about it in the Sunday section, calling it the best hard cider she'd had east of the mountains, and marveling that it came from Windfall apples and hedgerow scrub off an old ridge farm run by a girl of 23. Adela did not seek that peace and did not fully welcome it, because it brought a rush she wasn't ready for, cars full of city people winding up the Sawtooth Road with money and expectations, and she sold out in a morning and had to turn the rest away, and she did not like turning people away because it felt like the opposite of what her grandfather had written about stooping for what others stepped over. But the piece did a thing that could not be undone. It put a number on the county's overlooked fruit. It said, in black newsprint, that the feed store men could hold in their own hands, that the girl who'd hauled $3 into a ditch was selling that ditch back to the world at $4 a bottle and could not make enough of it, and the men around the cold stove, who had marked Boyce's prediction in October, were obliged now to unmark it, though they did so slowly and grudgingly, and mostly in silence, because a man does not enjoy watching his wisdom turned wrong by a girl and a wagon of hail-struck apples. Boyce Ledbetter came up the ridge in April, a year almost to the week from when Adela had arrived. He came alone in his good truck and he parked in the dooryard among the ruts his neighbors' vehicles had cut all spring, and he sat a moment before he got out, which Adela watched from the barn door and understood. He was not a man who liked to be where he was. He came across the yard with his hat in his hand, which was itself an admission, and he stood in front of the girl he'd told the whole feed store would be gone by fall, and he did not make a large production of it, because that was not the way of men like him any more than it was the way of Verna. He said the cider was good. He said his wife had been buying it all winter behind his back, and he'd finally tried it, and it was good. And he'd been wrong about it, and he'd said so at the feed store already, so she needn't wonder if he'd owned up. Adela said she appreciated that. Then Boyce said the other thing, the thing he'd really driven up to say, which was that he had a north slope of old grafted trees his daddy had planted, and he'd never done a thing with. 40-some trees of good hard cider varieties gone wild, and if she wanted the fruit off them come fall, she could have it. And if she wanted to press some of it here on shares, he'd bring it up himself. He said it plain, a fact offered for consideration, the same voice he'd used to tell her she was hauling money into a ditch, and Adela understood that this was Boyce Ledbetter's apology and his surrender and his handshake all at once, and she took it the way it was offered. She said she'd be glad of the fruit. She said shares sounded fair, and that was the whole of it. He put his hat back on and drove down the ridge, and the county's chief doubter had become, without ceremony, the county's newest supplier. Adela wrote it in her notebook that night, not the triumph of it, because she did not think of it as triumph, but the practical fact of it. 40-some trees of cider varieties on the Ledbetter North Slope, and what they might yield, and the map of the county's forgotten fruit grew by one more parcel. She was thinking that spring, in fruit and cold and time, not in triumph, because triumph was a thing that happened to a person, and the work was a thing a person did, and she had noticed that people who mistook the one for the other tended to stop doing the work. She did not stop. She spent the spring and summer of that second year the same way she'd spent the first, keeping the hens, tending the half-wild orchard on the place, driving the county for windfalls and hedgerow scrub, adding trees to her map, writing everything down. She hired Cordell on for real, a wage and a share, because he'd earned it, and because she could not do it alone anymore. And Cordell, who'd been a boy hanging around a feed store for loading work, became a young man with a trade and a stake in something. And his mother stopped him in the crossroads store one day and told Loretta, in a voice that carried, that the Franay girl had given her son back his future. And Loretta told Adela, and Adela did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, but she wrote it down, and she read it over sometimes on the hard days, of which there were still plenty. There were hard days. There were carboys that soured and had to be poured out, whole batches lost to a warm spell or a wild yeast that turned mean, and each one cost her weeks of work and a portion of her thin margins, and she did not hide these losses from herself the way a prouder person might have. She wrote them down too, the failures beside the successes, because Emmett's notes had recorded his own failures, and she understood that the failures were where the real knowledge lived. There was the matter of law, too, because the county and the state took an interest eventually in a girl selling hard cider off her porch, and there was a season of forms and fees, and a man from the capital who came up the ridge with a clipboard of his own and explained to Idella all the way she was not permitted to do the thing she was so plainly doing well. She did not fight him with argument. She fought him the way she fought everything, with patience and paperwork and the slow accumulation of small correctnesses, and she got her license in time and a proper bonded room built onto the barn with the coffee can money, done small, done paid for, no debt. Because Emmett's notes and Verna's whole life both preached the same sermon against owing, that a thing you owned outright could not be taken from you, and a thing you owed on was never truly yours. Build small, Verna said. when Idella showed her the plans. Let them ask for more before you make more. So Idella built small. She let the demand pull the growth, the way you let a good horse pull a load, at its own pace, never whipped. By the fall of that second year, the whole county did indeed come up the sawtooth road, and the phrase, which had started as Boyce's dismissal and Loretta's gossip, that the Frayne girl made something out of nothing, had inverted entirely, so that now it was said with wonder instead of scorn, said by the same men who had watched $3 die and were now bringing her their own windfalls on shares, said by city people and by a second food writer and by a distributor from the capital who wanted to carry it and whom Idella turned down gently because she was not ready to make more than she could make with her own hands and Cordell's in the cold stone room. She turned him down, and he did not understand it, because he thought in scale and she thought in fruit, and he drove away shaking his head, and Verna, who had heard the whole conversation from her stool, said good and nothing else, and Idella knew she'd chosen right. She had learned that the thing everyone urged, which was to grow, to seize the moment, to borrow and build and multiply, was the very thing that killed the sort of enterprise hers was, that turned a good cider into a mediocre one and a labor of love into a debt to be served. And she refused it again and again, gently, and the refusing was as much a part of her success as the pressing was, though no one saw it that way but Verna, and 40 years dead, Emmett. That was the fall Verna began to fail. She was past 85, and she had worked every day of her life, and the work had used her up the honest way, from the inside out, slow. She could not press any more, could hardly split kindling, and she spent more of the day on the porch and less in the barn, and Idella noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, without comment, and adjusted, taking on what Verna set down, one task at a time, the way Verna had once handed her the hen house. They did not speak of it directly. That was not their way. But there came an evening in November, the cold room full of the year's cider going through its slow change, the dooryard empty of the day's cars, the two of them at the stove, when Verna said, out of a long silence, that Emmett would have liked her. Idella asked, liked who, and Verna said, you. He'd have liked you. You'd do it the way he did it. And Idella, who had never met her grandfather, and had raised his cider out of the ground with his own inherited hands, felt something move in her chest that she did not have a word for, and she said, I wish I'd known him. And Verna said, you do. You've known him all along. And that was as close to tenderness as Verna's soul came. In the years Idella knew her, and it was enough, and Idella wrote it in the notebook that night and did not underline it, because some things you do not underline, you just leave, the way you leave good cider, and let time do the rest. Verna Sowell died the following March, in her sleep, in the house she'd lived in 80 years, with a cold room full of cider a few weeks from ready, and the first hard buds swelling on the trees she'd never see leaf out again. Idella found her in the morning and sat with her a long while before she called anyone, sat in the quiet of the 3 rooms Verna had kept, and she did not weep the loud way but the slow way, the way you weep for a thing that was right and is finished. And then she got up and did the chores, because the hens had to be fed and the cider had to be checked, and Verna, of anyone, would have understood that the work is how you carry it. The whole county came to the burying, up the little churchyard by the crossroads, and they came not out of duty, but because Verna Sowell had been a fixture of that place longer than most of them had been alive, and because her great niece had, in 2 short years, become a person the county was proud of in the shy way small places are proud, and Boyce Ledbetter carried a corner of the casket, and Loretta closed the store for the afternoon, and Cordell Tuff, grown into a young man of real substance, stood beside Idella at the graveside and did not say anything, which was the right thing to say. Verna left Idella everything, which by then was mostly the place itself, Windfall, the ridge farm free and clear, The half-wild orchard, the barn with its cold stone room and its bonded addition and its old iron press that had come down from Emmett to Verna to Idella across all those years and all that overlooked fruit. And Idella went on. That was the whole of what she did, and it was everything. She went on the way she had begun, driving the county roads for windfalls and hedgerow scrub, adding trees to her map, keeping the hens, writing it all in the notebook, pressing the ugly and the unwanted into something the whole county and half the state now drove for and could not get enough of and could not have made themselves because they did not have the patience or the eye or the inheritance. She hired on a second hand and then a third, all local, all young, all people the county had counted out for one reason or another, because she had a soft spot for the counted out that was really just a clear eye for worth, and she paid them fair and taught them the trade the way Verna had taught her, by handing over the work one task at a time. She built a second cold room, small, paid for, no debt, when the demand had grown enough to pull it, and she named the cider, finally, put a label on the brown bottles, and the name she chose was not her own, and not clever, and not anything a marketing man would have picked. She called it Emmett's, after the grandfather she had never met and had known all along, and under the name, in small letters, she put the line she'd copied out that first winter and pinned above her work table. The line that was the whole of it, the thing the world throws away. The fall, Idella turned 26, 5 years after a green August sky came down and flattened the Harkness orchard. She stood one afternoon at the back of the loading yard behind the Callaway feed store in Merrow's Bend, where they still ran the salvage auction off Merle Pettigrew's flatbed, and there was a wagon of hail-struck apples nobody had bid on, the skins pocked and split, going soft on their shaded sides, and she stood and looked at them a long time the way she looked at everything, and the men leaning on the fence rail did not laugh because they knew now, all of them, exactly what that stillness meant. She bid $3. She always bid $3 on the first ruined wagon of the season, whatever the fruit. A private observance nobody else fully understood, a way of keeping faith with the girl she'd been and the man whose hand she carried and the great-aunt who'd said he'd have liked her. Merle wrote it down. Cordell backed the truck to the tailgate, and Boyce Ledbetter, older now, come up to the sale to bring her fruit off his north slope on shares, tipped his hat as she counted out 3 worn bills into Merle's palm one at a time, and said, low, that it never stopped being a wonder to him, what she'd made of nothing. And Idella, wiping her hands on her jeans, looking at the wagon of ruined apples that the whole county had once been so certain was worth exactly $3 and no more, said the thing she always said, the thing that was true and had always been true, and that she had spent 5 years proving to a place that hadn't wanted to hear it. She said it was never nothing, it just took looking. If you've ever been handed something the world called worthless, a piece of ground, a talent, a stretch of your own life, and been told to your face it would come to nothing, take this story and pass it to somebody who's heard those words lately and needs to hear a different ending, because somewhere tonight there's a person standing at the back of their own loading yard, looking at their own wagon of bruised apples, waiting for one voice to tell them it was never nothing. Tell me in the comments about the thing you were told wasn't worth much and what you did with it, because those are the stories I come here to read. Tell me your town and your county and where in this wide dark you're listening from, and know that I read every last comment, every one, the way Idella read every line her grandfather ever wrote, slow and twice, and grateful for the hand that reached across the years to leave them.